What makes Gon such a controversial protagonist? On the surface, Hunter x Hunter, Yoshihiro Togashi's long-running magnum opus, is a standard shonen story. Each story arc focuses on a well-worn shonen trope, such as a training sequence or a tournament arc, things that Togashi has covered before in his series Yu Yu Hakusho. But where Hunter x Hunter fundamentally differs from the status quo is the way that it takes these formulas and then breaks them apart in interesting ways before once again returning to its shonen roots. In a 2018 interview with Weekly Shonen Jump magazine, Togashi revealed that with Gon, he originally planned to create a sort of good boy type of character that would, and I quote, win every character I would want for a son competition. But as soon as he started writing his story, he immediately realized that this sort of character would not fit the story he had envisioned at all. After all, what type of good boy would lightheartedly and without so much as a second thought abandon his foster mother to become a hunter and then search for his father who left him behind as a child just to follow his own selfish path? And so it was at that point, back in 1998, when the series published its very first chapter, that he decided to try something a little bit different. He came to the conclusion that the traditional tropes of shonen manga would not work for the world he was about to create. And so he decided to twist the general perspective on the genre in a number of unimposing, but at the same time highly impactful ways. As a result, Gon is not your classic all-good, all-powerful shonen hero, but rather a realistic version of it that has to face real consequences for his actions within the story world that Togashi has thrown him in. Thus, he has become one of the most controversially discussed shonen protagonists in history. And in this video, I want to explore with you why I believe that it makes Gon one of the most well-written shonen heroes of all time. Before we can dissect how Togashi has designed Gon as a character and what makes his take on the trope of shonen protagonists so unique, we first have to understand the general theme of Hunter x Hunter as a series overall. You might have heard before that the main theme of Hunter x Hunter is morality and exploring the thin lines between good and evil, black and white. And it's undeniably true that morality is a central part of the story's premise. However, I still believe that the actual theme of the story goes even further than this, because the theme, otherwise also known as the moral argument of a story, contrary to common belief, doesn't refer to a general subject matter such as love, class, power, or good versus evil. No, it much rather is the author's view on how to act in the world, and therefore also encompasses a certain moral vision that the author wants to explore throughout his story. Therefore, by definition, I believe that morality as a general concept cannot be the overall theme of Hunter x Hunter, but much rather is a part of it. The actual moral argument that Togashi is exploring in the story, and that he also uses to explore shonen as a genre overall, is what does it mean to be human in a superhuman world? And this overall theme then includes other important questions, such as what does it mean to hold power, and ultimately also, what does it mean to be moral? If you look closely enough, each character in the story is a variation of that theme, and that's exactly what I want to explore with you in this series of videos. And I hope you enjoy watching them just as much as I enjoyed making them. So why start with Gon? Well, Gon is of course the protagonist of the story. However, Hunter x Hunter takes a slightly different conceptual approach to their character web than other typical shonen do. No matter if it's Naruto, Bleach, or One Piece, amidst a usually very well-crafted group of supporting main characters, the hero always stands out clearly as the central focus point of the story. Therefore, Naruto is about Naruto himself becoming Hokage. Bleach is about Ichigo following his destiny as a Shinigami and exploring the supernatural world, and One Piece is of course about Luffy striving to find the One Piece and becoming king of the pirates. But what about Hunter x Hunter? While Gon does have a central desire within his ambition to find his father Ging that is driving the story forward, it is neither particularly intense nor is it very urgent. The story has no overarching big evil to defeat, no central and important object to be acquired, and no final destination to be reached. Rather than following a straight line towards a major goal, Gon and his friends follow a meandering path without apparent direction. They cover a great deal of territory in a haphazard way and encounter a variety of characters from different levels of society. At the same time, and in close relation to this, in Hunter x Hunter, the lines between protagonist and ally become very, very thin. So thin even, that it's fair to say that the story has not one, but two protagonists, Gon and Killua, with Gon being only a tad more important. This trope of the buddy story is quite commonly found in Hollywood movies, from stories like The Lord of the Rings, over 21 Jump Street, all the way to pretty much any love story out there being a typical example of this. But it is very, very rare in shounen anime and manga. In a buddy story, in essence, the hero is split into two parts, with one being a bit more relevant than the other, and both main characters having two different backgrounds, two different approaches to life, and two different sets of values and talents. As a result, the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts, and that's exactly what makes the combination Gon and Killua such a strong leading duo. These two protagonists are allies throughout the course of the series, but at the same time also have an overarching conflict of values and actions that gives character development to both of them. So, as you can see, Gon is already fundamentally different from other typical shonen protagonists simply based on his role in the story. His desire to find his father is not particularly intense, and he shares the role of the hero with his buddy Killua, who has his very own set of desires and weaknesses, and we will get further into their relationship in the next video. Now, this insight of the split hero can be boiled down even further to one of Hunter x Hunter's major strengths as a story. While many writers believe that all you need is a well-written hero that is the only person that really matters, Hunter x Hunter doesn't live from any individual character, but rather from an intricately crafted web of characters that interact with each other. As a result, the main group of protagonists move the plot along, but they don't carry it all by themselves. And thus, every single character that Togashi introduces helps to define those around them. So now that we've looked at the general premise for Gon's role in the story, and how it differs from conventional shonen heroes, let's finally talk about his character arc. At the beginning of the story, Gon is the stereotypical shonen poster boy. Young, plucky, irrepressible, spiky hair. In the first 20 or so episodes, he's basically Son Goku without the tail. He's seemingly nothing but good-natured, and depending on your preference as a viewer, his simple and pure attitude was probably either incredibly charming or almost intolerable to watch. His main desire is to find his father Ging and prove himself in the world of hunters, both of which he strongly idealizes. Equipped with immense talent, power, and skill, he leaves the isolated island he was raised on to take the hunter exam and follow his dreams. What Togashi basically does here is make us believe that Gon, just as so many other popular shonen characters, will grow to become a warrior of justice, fighting for what is right. He gives us the impression that in this story, it will be easy to distinguish who are the good guys and who are the baddies wearing capes, just as we've been trained to expect from so many other stories from that generation. However, it quickly becomes clear that the world of Hunter x Hunter is quite cruel and unforgiving. Actions and mistakes have real consequences here, and Togashi basically uses Gon as a sort of literary guinea pig to see what would happen to your typical shonen hero if you were to throw them into a realistic world. And so, slowly but steadily, as we pass from arc to arc to get to see more and more of the world and Gon's interaction with it, it becomes clearer and clearer that what now separates Gon the most from other shonen protagonists is his increasingly skewed moral compass. The fundamental lie that Gon believes about the world is that everything is either black or white, and that there is a clear line between good and evil. But since that is not how the real world works, where morality is mostly found on the spectrum of gray, Gon increasingly struggles to define what is good and what is bad based on the childish naivety that an 11-year-old simply has. And so, since objectively judging people's complex actions and behavior makes it very difficult to put them into one category or the other, Gon bases his morality on himself and his relationship with the person. People he's familiar with, such as Killua, Leorio, or Kurapika, are obviously good and worthy of his protection, while unfamiliar people dying during the hunter exam are generally ignored and not considered as important. Meanwhile, people Gon is unfamiliar with, but that conduct acts of violence and cruelty, must obviously be bad. This can strongly be seen when Gon gets captured by the Phantom Troop, as he despises them for taking innocent lives unrelated to them. And at the same time, Gon also categorizes people based on whether or not they're useful to him or his friends. Next to his naivety, this selfishness is Gon's second major weakness as a character. As a result, his morality appears to become increasingly skewed, where an objectively evil and twisted character like Beanold, who has massacred and eaten countless people, is actually thanked by Gon simply for helping him getting stronger. To better understand this development in Gon, and how his story ultimately reached the dark climax it did, I think the best thing is to look at the central relationship between hero and opponent. I think it's pretty fair to say that Gon's relationship with Hisoka is to Hunter x Hunter what unnecessarily dramatic music is to this channel. Without it, it just wouldn't feel the same. So when we first get introduced to Hisoka, Togashi promises us the typical shounen good guy takes on bad guy relationship between him and Gon. Hisoka is a psychopathic clown and the apex of hedonism, who cuts off another contestor's arms simply for bumping into him right at the start of the hunter exam. He will stop at nothing to get what he wants, no matter the damage it does to himself or others. As a result, at the beginning of their relationship, Gon and Hisoka appear to be clear-cut opposites, right down to Hisoka's appearance as a scary, bloodthirsty clown, which as we all know is the mortal enemy of kids everywhere. Nonetheless, despite all their seeming differences, over the course of the story, both characters find themselves inextricably drawn to each other. What started off as our typical good hero versus evil opponent dynamic slowly blurs into an uncomfortable similarity between the two. Their shared desire to better themselves through combat and their ecstatic enjoyment of battle is nothing unique to Hunter x Hunter. However, most shonen tend to shy away from so blatantly highlighting this objectively problematic stance of their main character. Togashi, on the other hand, makes it easy to imagine a small misstep in Gon's life pushing him into a position similar to Hisoka's. And we can see this in the story in a number of ways. The best example for this, however, might be Hisoka's fight in the Heavens Arena against the overconfident Castro. Simply to prove his superiority and provide a show, Hisoka sacrifices both his arms to gain the upper hand, no pun intended, and to satisfy his desire to dominate and humiliate his opponent. Then, a little later, during the Greed Island arc, Gon mirrors this morbid sacrifice against the bomber Genthru. He abandons a carefully thought out plan by taking an explosive attack from Genthru, which results in him losing an arm, basically for no other reason but his desire to prove his superiority and humiliate his opponent. And so, in a weird way, Gon and Hisoka become more and more similar throughout the story, to the point where Hisoka almost functions as a sort of mentor for Gon, a dynamic that we'll be exploring in more detail in another video. Now, however, we can finally look at what Gon's character arc looks like overall. To summarize what we've been discussing so far, Gon's character arc shows us what happens to a naive 11-year-old boy that holds enormous physical power when he's increasingly confronted with the harsh and cruel reality of the real world. This is basically the coming-of-age storyline we know from other shonen such as Naruto, only that Gon doesn't have a positive arc, but a negative one. Instead of growing more emotionally and morally mature, his character is slowly crushed by the brutal reality of the Hunter x Hunter world. This twist on the always rising shonen protagonist had not been explored in this much detail before, and has led to the very mature vibe Hunter x Hunter carries as a series. The premise for Gon's development throughout the story, as we've already discussed, are his naivety and his selfishness. Both of these things don't necessarily make him a bad person, but simply an inexperienced and overwhelmed child. Nonetheless, based on these weaknesses, Gon's character is set up to learn about the complex moral fabric of society and form a more realistic view of the world. This need is also moral, since through his basic moral compass and his naivety, combined with his enormous power, he starts to hurt people around him. However, it is not until the Chimera End arc that Gon completely spirals into a complete loss of his morality and ultimately his humanity. There are two events in particular towards the beginning of the arc that are representative for this change. The first is Gon's first ever kill in the story, a low-ranked armadillo Chimera Ant that bluntly attacks him and that Gon then slowly crushes to death. While it is definitely understandable that Gon defends himself and maybe even has to kill the Chimera Ant, the complete lack of reaction and emotional response to this act is what is truly shocking here. The pure Gon we got to know at the beginning of the story would never have been able to do such a thing, at least not without being deeply affected by it. And yet here, Gon has already been so consumed by power and violence that not only is he unshaken by his first kill, but he doesn't even give it a second thought. And even more impactful for his character is the death of his mentor Kite, who is killed by the royal guard Pitou. This first ever loss of a loved person affects Gon deeply, way more than is common for typical shonen characters. Much rather, Gon has a very realistic and human response to this event, and develops a rage and thirst for revenge against Pitou that is honestly quite unsettling to watch. As a result, his final act in the arc is one of the most notorious events in shonen manga. He uses the heavily injured and innocent Komugi as a mere tool to blackmail Pitou, giving no second thought about the overall situation and threatening to kill her. Once he learns that Kite is beyond help, in order to satisfy his wrath against Pitou, he calls upon all of the potential energy he will ever have for a short bout of combat, where he brutally kills his opponent without a single shred of remorse. In doing so, he trades the rest of his life for one short moment of violence, as the horrified Killua is unable to do anything but watch. It's some of the most harrowing reading or watching in the genre, a perverse version of Goku's Spirit Bomb. This is Gon's moment of moral choice, but instead of having a self-revelation about what it means to be human and how to behave justly and morally towards others in the situation, he gives in to his worst instincts. As Killua abandons his merciless past by forging a relationship with Gon, his friend sacrifices all of his remaining humanity for the ultimate act of revenge, and becoming a monster in the process. The self-revelation meant for Gon in this moment of extreme moral and human complexity is so obvious that we, the readers, have it instead, and it makes the scene just a more dark and uncomfortable to watch. The reason why this dark twist on the typical shonen protagonist arc works so well with Gon is because Togashi has followed one of the most important rules of writing when creating his character: creating empathy, but not sympathy. Creating sympathy for a character means that we approve of the hero's actions and completely identify with him as a person. If that were to be true, however, we could never have morally challenging and interesting main characters, and every single story would only serve a very limited and specific audience that shares the exact same views and values as the hero. Empathy, on the other hand, means that while we don't necessarily approve of the hero's actions, we do, however, understand them. We understand why the hero would make this decision and how he ultimately reached that moral conclusion. And as you might suspect, foreshadowing plays a crucial role in this. It makes the story cohesive and engaging. So when we apply this to Gon, while his brutal murder of Pitou and his failure to keep his humanity are devastating to watch, we do fully understand why Gon is behaving this way, and thus feel like we're watching the natural climax to his character arc. His entire journey has slowly built towards this dramatic moment, and we could unconsciously witness Gon's creeping moral decline without Togashi having to throw it into our faces. This is truly great writing. It is a great endpoint to the story, where Gon ultimately meets his father and is judged worthy of traveling with him. In a twisted way, he has managed to fulfill his desire, and going back to the traditional tropes of shounen, Togashi establishes a new equilibrium here. And as the author stated himself, at this point in Hunter x Hunter, where Gon meets Ging, he has pretty much already completed the story once. Now, you may rightfully say, doesn't Hunter x Hunter keep going afterwards? And of course, you're right. However, as you might know if you follow the manga, Gon is not really currently part of the story, and should he ever appear in it again in the form of a main character, he will need a completely fresh arc, with a new desire line and now possibly a positive character arc, where he re-evaluates his past actions and ultimately regains his humanity, ending up better and wiser than at the beginning of the story. The one who enabled Gon's second chance and survival, meanwhile, was his best friend Killua, who started off as the cold-blooded and inhuman assassin at the beginning of the story, who has now completely changed places with Gon. In many ways, Killua is written just as fantastically as Gon, and we'll be looking at his character and role in the story in the next video of this series. So stay tuned for that. Thanks guys, peace.